All right, and as always for each one of these sessions, we are recording these. So this will be available on the under the Genfluence YouTube channel. And I will also have it up on in the members area of the website. So that's under the genfluence.beer. You can see once you get there where you can go to sign up if you haven't already signed up. I highly encourage you to do that. That is where we are doing, almost all of our communication is going to be through there in terms of looking, if you're looking for any kind of documents, any of these slides, any of these videos, you'll be able to find it there in that members only area. And before we get started with tonight, we're actually getting started with our beer styles and talking through them. I just want to take a quick couple of seconds. If you saw the email this week, that went out on Friday, I briefly spoke about what's going on in the craft beer industry right now. And I won't spend too much time on it because I know a lot of us are very exhausted and kind of drained. And I really want these weekly meetings to be a space for us to come and for an hour and a half or so, we're just talking about beer and learning how to become better beer judges. But one thing I did want to offer to all of you, any of you, if you need to have, you've got a group, maybe you're in an area right now where getting together in person it still isn't safe, or maybe you are just more comfortable having hard conversations virtually in the comfort of your home. If anybody would like to use my Zoom, the Zoom that I use for these, as to hold a safe space meeting, to be able to meet with people to kind of talk about what's going on, or even better if you wanted to hold space to be able to do a meetup and talk about beer sales or beer judging, just let me know. I have this Zoom account that I'm not using all day, every day, and I'm happy to make that available to anybody who may be hurting right now and wants to have a space to just kind of scream into the void or let it all out. Just let me know, and we will get that, we can get that scheduled. And I'm more than happy to share my Zoom account with anybody. It's a paid account, so you can go longer than 40 minutes, and I can get that set up for you. So just let me know. And with that, we're going to jump into our first week of beer styles. And with this one particularly, I would really love to hear back from you, from all of you, on the format, on how it goes. Also, I've had a real couple of weeks. So please forgive me for any typos or anything weird in these slides today. I've been trying to complete them for a week now and keep getting distracted. So going forward, this will all be much smoother. But tonight we're going to go through, I think it's about 11 beer styles. This will be one of the weeks when we're going through them a lot quicker. We'll be doing a really big chunk of beer styles, and you'll be able to tell when you go look at the event calendar that going forward, these will really be pared down quite a bit. So, if you're here today and you're very overstimulated by all of the beer styles we'll talk about, just know that this is kind of an exception to what the rule is going to be, just in terms of the sheer amount of beer sales we're going to be talking about. So one of the things that I also want to say about these slides going forward, when we're talking about the beer styles, these will all be the exact same format. So what you're going to see here tonight is how I'm going to be formatting each one of the beer styles each week. Unless all of you are like, this is awful, we hate it, we would rather be done this way, in which case I will do it that way. I'm here to do this for you. So whatever kind of format or anything works for you, let me know, and and we can work on that. This was just the way that my brain kind of slotted all this information into these slides. So know that we're going to be talking about a lot of beer sales tonight. Know that going forward, I'm going to again, once I hear everybody's feedback, make all of the presentations the same, so that way when you show up what to expect, and you don't have to worry if you need to miss a week or something. You'll understand how the information is being presented to you. I'm trying to think what else I have to say about these tonight. Again, don't be overwhelmed just by the volume of beer sales we'll be talking about. As you saw, hopefully saw in the email last week, to prep for these, I think the most helpful thing is just to spend some time reading through the guidelines for each one of the styles. You'll see on the event calendar, also in those weekly emails that go out, the styles that are bolded are the ones that are most commonly tested, or most, you would most likely see even in a beer judging. You don't really see that many like Czech premium pale or Czech pale lagers. You will see Czech premium pale lagers. There's just some styles you don't see a ton of. So we'll touch on those and talk through them. The ones that are bolded are really the ones where, when you're prioritizing your study time, I would prioritize those styles. And I think with that, I will get started. I'm going to pull my slides over here so I'm not like weirdly looking over to the side instead of talking into the camera. And let me see, I might actually move you all over here so I'll weirdly look at you, because I have some polls tonight to make this not quite as just like a rote going through things. So let me share my screen. And we'll get started. And as always, as you have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. I have once again positioned my webcam, so I have to do this weird duck down thing to see when there are questions, but I will definitely pause as we're going through these and see what kinds of questions we have. If you all have, if it hasn't already been asked already, I would love to know if you have some of the styles, if you're drinking some of the styles that we're talking about tonight, if you would let us know what you have. I actually have a backup one, but I've got Narragansett that I have a full one. I feel like I'm going to need both of them after the day I've had. So I have, this is a craft lager, where it's really going to fall into the American lager category that we're talking about. So if you have a beer that you're joined with us tonight, I would say let's do a cheers to everyone. And, let's smash the patriarchy together and let's learn about some beer styles. So I'm going to do this again really quickly because it's super distracting for me to have see myself out of the periphery on my second screen. So tonight, these are the styles that we're going to be covering. And like I said, this is really, there might be one or two more weeks like this where we have several styles, like a big chunk that we're covering. But as you can see here, there's really 4 styles that we will really emphasize and talk about because you're more likely to see these on, again, on a Cicerone exam, on your BJCP tasting exam. But I'm going to talk through each of them. And what I'll plan to do is when I get to the end of the standard American beer, I'll take a pause and we will answer any questions that you all have about the styles, and then we'll continue on. And I'm really hoping that I don't forget that I actually wrote some polls and questions for you all today to help kind of hopefully help you think through some of these styles and connect some dots. So hopefully I won't forget to do those. If not, we'll just do them all at the end. So we saw this last week, and we've seen this a couple of times already, our BJCP score sheets. The one on the left is going to be the competition score sheet. So this is when you go to beer judging and you sit down at a table, you're very likely going to see this sheet. This is kind of the classic, routine competition score sheet that you'll fill out. When you go into the tasting exam, you're going to see that exam score sheet. So you can see most of the information on the right-hand side is the same. The biggest difference is you don't actually have those flavor descriptors on the left-hand side. But by the time you all get to those beer judging exams, you're really not going to need those descriptors anyway. You're already going to know what all of this stuff is. So when we're talking about standard American beer, I always like to emphasize to people that they are styles in their own right. And I very much, as a beer professional, I like to let people like what they like. So when I'm talking through these styles, understand that I'm not denigrating them in any way. I always just like to say that because usually like if I'm in an in-person class and we're talking about standard American beer and we start talking about light lager and lager, I always kind of feel this reaction from people that they're like, oh man, this beer sucks. And it doesn't. It is its own style with its own guidelines. So when we're talking about American beers, we're talking about both ales and lagers. And really the point of something like a standard American beer is to, particularly something like an American light lager or an American lager, the point is to appeal to the largest amount of people. And the way you can appeal to the largest amount of people is to make it really as flavor neutral as you can. Now, with a lot of the craft versions of things like an American lager and American light lager, you may get some more flavor in there, but generally the idea behind a standard American beer is, the beers that are really designed to be just like enjoyed in volume kind of thing. So we're going to start with American light lager. And I should also add that all of this information that you will see on these slides is directly from the BJCP guidelines. So if you've already read the guidelines, this is going to sound really familiar to you. If you haven't read the guidelines, it will look really familiar to you when you read them. The only exceptions we have to the information coming from the commercial examples is with the commercial examples. So you may see, as we go through some of these styles, I don't have commercial examples listed exactly how they are in guidelines. Excuse me. Generally, I do try to keep it within the BJCP guidelines, but these haven't been updated since 2015, and in particular, we've found out that a lot of breweries are kind of garbage and shouldn't be supported. So where those are mentioned as commercial examples, they've actually been swapped out with different ones. So I need to take a drink really quickly before I just start coughing all over the microphone. So with American Light Lager, the overall impression, again, this is straight from the BJCP guidelines. The overall impression is going to give you a good overall impression, I guess is the best way to say it. So these are going to be highly carbonated, very light bodied, nearly flavorless lager designed to be consumed very cold. Very refreshing, very thirst quenching. The whole point of these things is just to have something refreshing and cold to drink. And one of my dogs is not happy about talking about American light lager. So I included the stats on each one of these. As you will remember from, I believe, that one of the very first times we talked in terms of getting prepared for your BJCP exams or your Cicerone exams, do not spend a lot of time trying to memorize these stats. Actually, I will tell you, do not spend any time trying to memorize these stats unless you're going for your advanced Cicerone or your master Cicerone, or if you're going for a master level BJCP score on your written exam. You do not need to know these stats. Don't spend time trying to memorize them. Just have an idea generally of where the ABV range is. So if you had an American light lager and you get some alcohol burn, that's going to tell you that maybe that ABV is a little bit high for this style. Similarly with the IBU, if you get something that's super bitter, you can just remember, hey, something like an American light lager is not supposed to have very much bitterness at all. And it's also supposed to be very light in color. Our commercial examples, you're probably familiar with them, especially if you're located in the United States. We have Bud Light, Coors Light, Keystone Light, Miller Light, Old Milwaukee. And another thing I will mention about the commercial examples is that not every commercial example that is listed in the BJCP guidelines is listed on here. So just understand that if, when you're going through and reading the commercial examples, you may see some additional examples that I didn't include. I try to include 3 or 4, up to 5 in each one of these. So you really get an idea for what that style is supposed to taste like. And I know we haven't spent a ton of time just discussing beer styles and what that means. But when we're talking about commercial examples, these are the beers that are listed. If you want to know what an American lager, light lager is supposed to taste like, you can get one of these examples and taste it. And chances are, as assuming that there's no like process defects, which in beers like this, there's not going to be, or any kind of like packaging mishandling, what you're tasting is going to be it's going to define the style. And another interesting thing to note about those a lot of times is when, and we'll talk about a couple of examples tonight, but when you are the commercial example, you not only create the definition for the beer style, but you can also, like when you make the rules, you can break the rules, which is why when we'll start talking about, actually, I'll just flip over to American Lager next. No, I won't. So I will get back to that. When we're talking about something like an American Lager, something like Bud Light, like Budweiser, you'll read oftentimes that it has an acceptable level of green apple aroma and flavor to it. That, fun fact, is actually very often misidentified as acetaldehyde, which it is not. But they will have it's okay for that style to have a very light kind of green apple flavor, because Budweiser's yeast adds that flavor to it. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that even within the commercial examples, you're going to have a wide range of what the interpretations available for that beer, which is also one of those really great things when you start to be a beer judge and sit at beer judging tables. When you have 10 American light lagers in front of you, you're really going to learn 10 different interpretations of how to make an American light lager, because it's not all one thing, right? Every beer style will have several commercial examples, and that's part of the fun, is learning how those commercial examples are not only similar, but how they're different, and how they're different but still within the guidelines. So while I'm kind of on my soapbox about guidelines, one of the other things that I will say about it is that they are created by consensus. They're created by consensus. If you're like somebody like the Brewers Association, you're updating your guidelines every year. If you're someone like the BJCP, you're updating them every few years. But generally what happens is, I can actually speak directly to New England IPAs. When those were being added to the Brewers Association guidelines, I happened to be talking to somebody from the Brewers Association who told me they were about to announce that this was the new guideline. And I said, how do you do it? How do you decide what that guideline should be? Because they're creating a style, right, to fit what the market has already created. And he said they get generally, the beers, the New England IPAs that were considered the best. So something like Heady Topper or Juicy Bits from WeldWorks, all of these different beers that were considered like the examples of New England IPA. And they sent them out to a lot of different people, and they tasted through them. And that's how they come up with the guidelines, was kind of, is defining the upper and the lower limits and what kinds of ingredients are most commonly used. So that's how guidelines get developed. So the important thing to remember about that is that they are decided by consensus, and they change over time. And we'll talk about that also a little bit more when we get into the Czech beers. So off my off my guideline soapbox, we'll continue talking about American Light Lager. So the way I have set these up is, if you've got a score sheet in front of you, we'll go through, and I've taken what's written in the guidelines, in my very grubby guidelines, and I've slotted them into where you would put those on a score sheet, what you would expect to be writing on a score sheet. And one thing to remember as well, and I know we talked about this a little bit last week, is that you write down your perceptions, and the absence of a perception is still a perception. So if you have a beer in front of you that says that it's an American Light Lager, and you smell the malt aroma and it's very strong and it smells roasty, that's a perception. So you write it down and you say, this really isn't to style for an American Light Lager. So when we're talking about American Light Lager, the malt, low to none. If you get any kind of malt flavor, it's going to be grainy or it's going to be corn-like. The reason you're going to get some corn-like is because an American Light Lager can be up to, I believe it's up to 30% of either corn or rice products. And so when we're talking about corn and rice products, that can be corn syrup, which is not the same as high fructose corn syrup. It can be rice syrup. It can be flaked rice. It can be flaked corn. It can be whole rice. It can be whole corn. But they can have, generally as a style, they will have up to 30% corn, or rice added as what's known as an adjunct. So an adjunct is when you're taking a portion of the malt, like the malted barley, your sugar source, out of a recipe and substituting something else in. So an American light lager is going to have corn, is going to have rice, corn and or rice. And I will also say it doesn't have to. So you can make an American and 100% malt American light lager. So that's why they couch it in terms of it can have up to. Up to also means that it can have 0. So for hops, light to none. If you get any kind of hop aroma, it's going to be spicy or floral. If you recall from last week in talking about our what kinds of hops provide what kinds of aromas and flavors, then you may remember that a noble hop, so something that's German or Czech, is going to be what's giving the beer that spicy or floral flavor. When we're talking about fermentation, we're talking about lagers. So we want a clean fermentation character. If you can get any kind of esters or phenols, then that indicates there's something wrong with that. There was something that went wrong with that fermentation, but you do see here that note that you can have a light apple fruitiness. The reason you can have that light apple fruitiness is because Budweiser's yeast that it uses produces a light apple fruitiness. So when you make the rules, you get to break the rules. And if you get a little bit of light DMS, so that's going to be your canned corn smell, that is not a fault. And I will thank my friend Nat, who was looking at these slides for me earlier, for pointing out I didn't have a chance to change it. Technically, DMS is produced by malt, not by fermentation. So before I post these slides, I'll get that fixed, just so that way, as when you're learning and you're reading elsewhere that DMS comes from the malt, you're not like, then why did Jen put it under fermentation? So just know that's something that I need to get corrected. And when we're talking about appearance, very pale straw to pale yellow, very clear. You're not going to have a lot of head retention. Your head color is going to be white and your head texture is going to be very frothy. When we're talking about the flavor, so again, you know, we've completed, we're looking at our score sheet, we've completed that first section and that second section, and now we're to the flavor section. A lot of times when you're evaluating a beer, you will find that, you know, your flavor is going to be very similar to your aroma, but not always. And that's another important observation you can make. If you get a very strong aroma that you don't get in the flavor, you can write that down, and vice versa. So with the flavor, we're going to expect to get a low to very low grainy or corn-like flavor. It may be perceived as sweet simply because it has very low bitterness to it, and we're going to have a relatively neutral palate. So again, when we're talking about American Light Lager, when we're talking about American Lager, these are beers that are designed to appeal to the masses, and the way that they do that is to make them as flavor neutral as possible. With hops, you're going to have low to very low bitterness, and you're going to have low to no hop flavor. If you do get some hop flavor, it's going to be floral, spicy, or herbal. Fermentation, clean lager fermentation, you shouldn't expect to get any esters or phenols from that. Your balance is going to vary from slightly malty to slightly bitter, but it's generally going to be fairly balanced. So when we say balanced, that's just what it sounds like. It's going to be right there in between being malt forward and being hop forward. Is going to be right there in between the two. And then with your finish and aftertaste is going to be very crisp and have a very dry finish. The body is going to be very light. Sometimes that can come across as watery. It's going to have very high carbonation. You shouldn't have any warmth, and you might have a little bit of a carbonic bite due to that high carbonation. So when we're talking about the carbonic bite, I know I've got that term in here a couple of other times. You know, the carbonic bite can come from very high carbonation. Sometimes if you have a beer that has a very high minerality, you can also kind of get that, just that kind of crispness on your palate. And I apologize because I don't know exactly why that is, but you will get it with some beers. So next we'll talk about American Lager. So this is really going to be very similar to American Light Lager, but just a little bit more. So this is going to be a very pale, highly carbonated, light body, well-attenuated lager with a very neutral flavor profile and low bitterness. Served very cold, it can be a very refreshing and thirst-quenching drink. Again, don't worry about the stats. Just know an American lager is going to be fairly mid-range in terms of ABV. It's going to be very low bitterness, and it's going to be very pale in color. Commercial examples, Budweiser, Coors, Miller High Life, PBR. PBR is one of my favorites. I did not like it when hipsters liked it. I actually came around to it a couple years ago. So I guess that makes me like a super hipster. And then Special Export. So when we're talking about this, again, it's going to be very similar to the American Light Lager. You're not going to expect a lot of flavor from either the malt or from the hops. If you get any kind of malt flavor, it's going to be grainy, it's going to be corn-like. If you get any hops, again, it's going to be spicy or floral. We want that clean fermentation profile. And again, you see that there's that light apple fruitiness there. That is going to be acceptable because Budweiser's yeast produces that light apple fruitiness. Very pale straw to medium yellow, very clear, low head retention, white head color, and very frothy head texture that's not going to last for very long. Our flavor is going to be a lot like our aroma again. So we're going to have a very low to low grainy or corn-like flavor. Again, we're trying to make it as neutral as we can. Again, it may be perceived as a bit sweet, but that's not because there's a lot of residual sugars in it. It's because the bitterness is very low. So this is a very delicate balance between our malt sweetness and our hop bitterness because they're both just so low. With the fermentation, again, we want a clean lager fermentation. It's going to be generally balanced. So sometimes it can be slightly malty or slightly bitter, but it's really, here's the center. Sometimes it can be this, sometimes it can be that. And then a good crisp and dry finish. Again, designed to be very refreshing. Body is going to be low to medium low, carbonation very high. And again, because of that high carbonation, you make it a little bit of a carbonic bite. So next we have cream ale. This is the lawnmower beer. This is generally, you'll hear people refer to it as a lawnmower beer. So with cream ale, it's very, very similar to American lagers, except that it's an ale. And the reasoning behind that is because, the American light lagers, the international pale lagers, all of those make up something like 95% of the beer that is drank worldwide. So, things like Budweiser, that's what almost everybody is drinking everywhere in the world. And when you're making a lager, it's going to take quite a bit longer to ferment because your lager yeast has to ferment at colder temperatures, which means it moves slower, which means that it's going to take longer for that fermentation to be finished. The other part of a lager fermentation is that, while that's happening, you're using up tank space. And particularly for breweries like craft breweries that are very small, they don't have the time a lot of times to let beer sit for 3 or 4 weeks as opposed to maybe 2 weeks. So that's kind of one reason why you haven't seen a lot of craft lagers into the last couple of years. But then as you're lagering the beer, you have to let it sit in tanks. So you're taking up tank space no matter what. Even if you're not keeping it in your fermenters and you're moving it to a lagering tank, you still need space for that. And most craft breweries, of course, are way smaller than places like Budweiser or Coors, and they just don't have the time or the space to do lagers. So the next best thing is something like a cream ale. A cream ale is going to be have a little more character to it than an American lager because it's an ale yeast. So you'll get a little bit more of the phenols and esters, more so the esters. But the cream ale is kind of the solution to an American lager, an American light lager, when you don't have the time or space to actually make lagers. So again, it's going to be very mid-range ABV, low to slightly moderate bitterness, and fairly light in color. So Jenny Cream, Little King's Cream Ale, Spotted Cow, Old Style, Sleeman Cream Ale. Like I'm reading through this right now and I'm realizing that there's so many cream ales that are like, if I say Jenny Cream, like all of the upstate New York people know exactly, no Jenny Cream. Same for Old Style out of Chicago, same for Spotted Cow out of Wisconsin. Like those are all very like iconic for their locations in a way that I don't think a lot of other beer styles have. So when we're looking at the score sheet, with the aroma, we would expect that aroma to be medium low to low and have sweet corn-like notes. For hops, again, medium low to none, or I guess more correctly, none to medium low. They can be any variety, but floral, spicy, herbal are the most common. And again, that's because we're using typically noble hops, so German, Czech hops that are going to give us those flavors. Low fruity esters are optional. Again, we're using an ale yeast, so it's possible that it's going to create more esters, and light DMS is allowable. One of the reasons why DMS is allowable in things like cream ale and American light lager and American lager is because of the use of Pilsner malt. So when you're using, if you remember last week when we were talking about beer flavor, base malt, within the base malt category, Pilsner malt is going to have the least amount of kilning. And I won't go into too much of a deep dive on DMS, but generally what you would want to keep in mind is any beer that's going to have a high proportion of Pilsner malt in it, DMS is going to be allowable at low levels because that's going to happen sometimes when you're using something like a lot of Pilsner malt, you're going to have more DMS. When we're talking about color, pale straw to moderately gold, it's usually paler. Brilliant and sparkling clarity, you're going to have fair head retention. Your head is going to be white and your texture is going to be low to medium. For flavor, it's going to look a lot like the aroma. So it's going to be low to moderately low, malty or sweet. Both of those descriptors, if you joined me last week, you know that I am not a fan of those. Low to moderate corniness, you're going to have low to medium low bitterness. And if you do have any hop flavor, again, you're going to expect the floral, spicy, herbal flavors that you would find in something like a classic German hop or a classic Czech hop. DMS commonly found but not required, but it is not a fault if you're judging a cream ale and you pick up on DMS in the aroma or the flavor. Low fruity esters are optional and it's usually well attenuated. So well attenuated means that there's not a lot of, the yeast has done a very good job at eating all of those available sugars within the beer. Again, balance is going to be very balanced. We're trying to get as close to that American lager profile as we can. And your aftertaste is going to vary from somewhat dry to fairly sweet. Light to medium body, high carbonation is going to be crisp and smooth. So then our last in the American beer category, the standard American beer category, is going to be American wheat beer. So this is going to be a refreshing wheat beer that can display more hop character and less yeast character than its German cousin. So when we're talking about the German cousin here, what we're talking about is the German Hefeweizen or the German I'm totally blanking. Oh, Weissbier. Sorry, everybody. It's been a day. But so, and I believe we mentioned this last week, but Hefeweizen and Weissbier are the exact same style. And those are, so if you see or read, or if you hear me say a Hefeweizen and a Weissbier, know that those are the same thing. It just depends on where you are, how people refer to it. I frequently will say it, interchange the two throughout. So when we're talking about German, we're talking about that Hefeweizen and wheat beer. So again, with an American wheat beer, that really developed in response to the German Hefeweizen and to a lesser extent, the German or the Belgian wheat beer. So that's, if you're looking for a really great sensory panel to do at home, get an American wheat beer, a Belgian wheat beer, and a German Hefeweizen and taste them side by side and really see how very different they are. And that's a great way to train your palate. That's also, I like the American wheat or German Hefeweizen, or the wheat beer and the Hef, the wit and the American wheat. Those you will often see on the certified Cicerone tasting exam. So it's a great trio to get really familiar with. So with the American wheat beer, we're going to have a clean fermentation character. Again, it's an American beer. Most American yeast typically is very clean in its profile. So you're going to have, if we're talking about something like a California ale yeast, just a classic American ale yeast is going to be very, I don't want to say exactly flavor neutral, but really when we're thinking about up until very recently, what kind of beer was mostly being produced in the United States, it's American lager. So when, American ales were being brewed, especially after Prohibition, the goal was really to make that ale yeast as close to a lager yeast as possible. So you're going to have a very clean fermentation character. That's going to allow for those bready, doughy, and grainy wheat flavors to really be complemented by the hop flavor and the bitterness rather than the yeast qualities. Whereas with something like a German Weissbier with a Hefeweizen, the yeast is the star of that show. So as we talked about last week, with a German Hefeweizen, you're going to have those really big banana and clove flavors. You're not going to have that with an American wheat beer. Again, mid-range. The IBUs are starting to get up just a little bit. It's still not a terribly bitter beer, but it is a decidedly American beer in that the bitterness is a little more assertive than what you would find in something like a Hefeweizen. And usually a moderate, like a 3 to 6 SRM is going to be a gold to approaching a dark gold in color. So the three commercial examples I have here are Bell's Oberon, that's iconic, Goose Island 312, and Widmer Hefeweizen. And the interesting, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time because I know we have a ton of beer sales to go through, but the interesting thing about the Widmer Hefeweizen, it is very confusing when you first see that because it's like, why would you name an American wheat beer Hefeweizen when it's an American wheat beer? And the reasoning behind that was because when the Widmer brothers and the Pacific Northwest were making beer, they had something similar to, I believe it was an alt beer, and then they were filtering their American wheat, or they were filtering their wheat beer. They weren't making Hefeweizen, it was just a wheat beer. And one of their biggest accounts wanted them to make a third beer, but they didn't have enough space to make a third beer. So what they did was they just didn't filter some of their wheat beer and started sending that out instead. So that's, a lot of times you'll see an unfiltered beer. Most craft beer is unfiltered, but they just didn't filter their beer instead of, like they created it that way. So they had their alt beer, their American wheat beer, and then their unfiltered American wheat beer. And what was happening is, because this is also the United States in the mid 80s, is that people were sending the beer back because it was cloudy. Because in the United States, everyone was used to drinking American lagers, American light lagers that were crystal clear, and they thought something was wrong with the beer because it was cloudy. So they changed the name of it to Hefeweizen. So that way, when people ordered it, they would be more likely to be expecting a cloudier beer. And actually, this whole time I've been saying Hefeweizen. If you're ever around one of the Widmer brothers, technically it's pronounced Hefeweizen, and they will definitely correct you. So I've read in books, they haven't corrected me, but Widmer Hefeweizen is, that's why there's an American wheat beer that's called a Hefeweizen or a Hefeweizen. So when we're looking at the score sheet here, low to moderate, grainy, bready, or doughy wheat character, light to moderate malty sweetness is acceptable. So I'm going to give you all your first pull of the night as I frown down at this to see where I can find it. And I want you all to tell me, if you remember from last week, why is malty sweetness not a good descriptor for aroma? And I have that set to multiple choice, but there's really only one right answer. So definitely vote on that. I will keep talking while you guys do that. When we're talking about hops, medium low to none, it can be any variety, but the floral, spicy, herbal are most common. And actually, while you all are doing that, and everybody is doing a great job, you are correct. That is not true. Sweetness is a taste, not an aroma. So thank you everyone who remembered that and popped that in there. And I was just realizing as I was saying this that I think I messed up on my hops. So I'm going to look through here really quickly. Yes, so the one thing that I left out on the American wheat score sheet on this slide is that citrusy is very popular for an American wheat beer. So many American beers are very citrus, or so many American hops are very citrus forward. So I'll make another note of that and make sure that I correct that before I upload these for you all. Esters can be moderate to none. You will have no clove phenols. You will have no banana esters. One of the things I did recently when I was at, good job, everybody got 100% on that, so great job. When I was at the national homebrew competition a few weeks ago, one of the categories I judged was American wheat beer. And there were definitely some entries that tried to like sneak their Hefeweizens into the American wheat beer category, because you had those clove phenols and those banana esters. If you have what somebody is calling an American wheat beer in front of you, it should not taste like a Hefeweizen at all. So the appearance is going to usually be pale yellow to gold, brilliant hazy, with the yeast approximating that Weiss beer style. Your head is going to be, it's a wheat beer, is going to have this big, beautiful, long-lasting, fluffy white head. And then, let me see, there we go. So with the flavor, light to moderately strong bready, doughy, or grainy wheat flavor. You may have moderate malty sweetness, or it can finish quite dry. And this is one of those styles that is really interesting to judge, because they're within the guidelines. There are so many interpretations that you can get a very dry, very hop forward American wheat beer. You can also get a very grainy, doughy, almost sweet, more of a wheat or malt forward American wheat beer. Bitterness will be low to moderate. It may last into the finish, and low to moderate hop flavor. So that can be citrusy, spicy, floral, or fruity. Again, no banana esters, no clove phenols. You may have a few esters from that American ale yeast, but it does not have to be there. The balance is usually even, but it may be slightly bitter, and it may have a slightly crisp finish. Your body is going to be medium light to medium, your carbonation medium high to high. And since it's a wheat beer, you're going to have that very soft, fluffy impression of it. So we're going to move over to the international, but before we do that, I'm going to see if we've got any questions while I also take a sip. Yeah, so this first question is fantastic. Using the standard American beer style, since they are nearly flavorless, is there a beer style or commercial example you recommend to use for training with the beer defect spikes, like the spikes from a Roxa, for example? Great question. I would use, when I'm doing flavor spikes, if I'm doing off flavor training, specifically with a Roxa, I use Amstel Light. So that's actually an international pale lager. But really I would say something like a PBR, or you can go for something like a Heineken, which again is an international pale lager. Those are going to be your best bets. And I say Amstel Light specifically because that's what Cicerone uses on their exams, and that's not confidential information. They tell you that when you take the exam, that the base beer is Amstel Light. So knowing that that's what the base beer is, I would train using the base beer. I will have a caveat. So I was saying Heineken is an all malt beer. There aren't any adjuncts in Heineken. And I say that because I have used craft lagers before that have a portion of flaked maize. And people get very angry with that because you already have kind of that light corn aroma and flavor, that when you're trying to train somebody on DMS, which has a corn aroma and flavor, they get really angry about that. So I would say to stick with Amstel Light, do something like Heineken, do something like PBR. But really, when you're training with something like your off flavor spikes, that's why it's so important to have a control. So when I'm talking about a control, that would be, say I'm doing, let's say that I'm sitting down for the tasting portion of the certified Cicerone exam. The first part is off flavors. So you will have 4 samples in front of you, and 3 of them will be spiked with an off flavor, but you also have a control. So that control is your base, right? That is, you're going to be comparing every beer that you smell and taste to that beer. So, when you're using something like an American lager or American light lager, as long as you have that control and people understand that they are supposed to be, perceiving that control as the standard and then measuring the other samples against that, it's fine. But that is something that is hard for, maybe it's just hard for me to communicate well. But as you get more advanced with your off flavors, you'll learn that the base beer doesn't really matter, what is not really affecting how you're perceiving the spikes. That was a very long answer to your question with a lot of extraneous information. So Amstel Light is going to be your best bet. Our adjuncts only, the sugar source replacement in the grain bill can also include other ingredients that are not the main four, like seasoning, herbs, fruit. Adjuncts are the sugar replacement for the grain bill. You can also have sugars that are coming from something like fruit. Something like a seasoning or an herb is not going to have fermentable sugars in it. So adjuncts can be, and I'm not as familiar with my BJ's or my Brewers Association guidelines. Sweet potatoes, coconuts, rye, wheat, spelt, sugars, rice, corn, all of those things are considered adjuncts. Sorghum. So those are adjuncts are going to be the only sugar source replacement in the grain bill. Something like seasoning, fruits, herbs, those are really going to be additions. And that may sound like a distinction without a difference. And Sheena, I'm really not happy with that answer I just gave you. So let me try to put it in a little more succinctly, and I'll make a note of that. Maybe I can include that in our email this week, but that is a great question. All right, and then for light lagers, cream ales, are P&W hop aromas flavors instead of noble hops considered a fault? Stone fruit, piney, caddy, etc. How do you account for that in scoring? That is a really good question, and let me actually look at my my guidelines here, because I believe that they say that they may. So it's, yeah, that is an interesting question, Cassandra, because I feel like if I were judging a beer and I was judging something that says that it was an American light lager and I got stone fruit, piney, caddy, like Pacific Northwest hops, I probably would say that these, like the hop profile is not correct for the style. Now, that doesn't mean that the beer is bad. So I have left feedback for that previously on different score sheets where it's like, hey, this beer is really good. It tastes great. You're not using the correct ingredients for it. So I guess the easiest way to answer that is yes, that would be a fault if the guidelines say that it should be that you're really looking for more of a noble hop aroma. And it may be that if you're using something like Pacific Northwest or even New World hops in something like a lager, that may more appropriately fit into a category such as an IPL. So I think that there are styles now that allow for that. If you're looking at the BJCP guidelines, I feel like a light lager cream ale, I probably would say the hop profile is not correct for that style. All right, so I'm going to get started with the International Pale Lager. And these next few, I'm really going to just tick through pretty quickly because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussions and any kinds of questions that you all have. But when we're talking about an international pale lager, really this is going to be American lager, but just made not in America. So it's going to be highly attenuated pale lager without strong flavors, typically well balanced and highly carbonated. Served cold, is refreshing and thirst quenching, just like an American lager. It's going to have a similar ABV. It can be a little more bitter. It's going to generally be the same color. So our examples here: Asahi Super Dry, Bureau Moretti, Corona Extra, Heineken, Red Stripe, Singha, the list goes on and on of an American pale lager, but it's more or less going to be very similar to an American lager, just not an American lager. Low to medium low grainy malt, slightly corny sweet. International pale lager can also have up to 40% of corn or rice. And I was remiss when we were talking about American lager. American lagers can have up to, I believe it's 40% corn or rice in them as well. Very low to medium, spicier floral hops. And actually an interesting story, this goes for the American lager. But when we actually, I'll just go back to this slide. So see Heineken. Heineken has that green bottle. Corona has that clear glass bottle. And if you've ever had one of those, you understand that when you open them, you get skunky flavor. You get that light struck flavor. And the reason for that is because of that glass that the bottle, or the glass that the bottle is in, the glass that the beer is in. So brown beer bottles, the reason why most beers most beers now are in cans, but the reason why brown bottles are so common is because they block about 80% of UV light. And what happens when the UV light interacts with the isomerized hop alpha acids inside of the beer, they create that skunky flavor, that light struck flavor. So something like a green bottle only blocks about 20% of the sunlight. So you're going to get a skunky beer pretty quickly with a green bottle. If you have a clear bottle, you get skunky beer almost immediately because there's nothing protecting those isomerized hop alpha acids from interacting with the direct sunlight, which is also what happens if you're sitting outside on a sunny day. This actually happened to me on Saturday. I was sitting outside having a beer, a beautiful sunny day. The issue with that is that the sunlight can still interact with that beer and still create that skunky flavor. So that's why you might find your beer getting skunked pretty quickly, even like in the sunlight. So you can try to shade it somehow or keep it in the shade to avoid that. But so I have two additional interesting things about this. So Corona Extra is available in a clear glass bottle and is also available as Corona Familiar, and that's in a brown bottle. And what they found when they started putting Corona in the brown bottle is that customers were still buying the Corona in a clear bottle because that skunky flavor is part of the Corona experience. I know it's been several years for me since I've had a Corona, but like I know that flavor, that aroma profile very well. And to me, that is drinking a Corona. So customers really preferred the skunky flawed beer because that's what they were expecting. But going back to, that's going to be too far to go back, but with Miller High Life, so that's also comes in a clear glass bottle. And the reason that doesn't get skunky is because Miller uses a special kind of hop that they make called a tetra hop. And the tetra hop has those isomerized hop alpha acids removed from it. So a Miller Lite, any Miller product like Michelob Ultra, I think MGD 54, if that's still a thing, any of like the Miller products that are in the clear bottles will never get skunked no matter what, because they use this special kind of hop product that has that removed from it. So that's really neither here nor there. I can't imagine you would be asked that on any of the exams. It's just a thing to know to, dazzle your friends with your beer bottle knowledge, I guess. So when we're talking about, I know I already talked about the malt with the hops. That's what made me think about the clear glass bottles. Clean fermentation profile, low levels of yeast character, again, maybe a little bit of that light apple fruitiness, and then a light amount of DMS or corn aroma is not considered a fault. Your appearance, pale straw to gold, very clear. Your head's not going to last very long, but you are going to have a nice white frothy head. For your flavor, the same kinds of flavors, and it's going to be with International Pale Lager. You may start to see more beers that are 100% malt. So you may start to get more of like that bready water cracker kind of quality. And it actually, you can expect a little bit more flavor from an International Pale Lager. So with this, I'm going to move on. Know that this information is here for you. I don't know that we need to read through line by line all of these, especially since you have your BJCP guidelines. So we will talk about American International Amber Lager. Now we're starting to get into some beers that have a little more color to them, a little more flavor. So our International Amber Lager is going to be well attenuated malty amber lager with an interesting caramel or toast quality and restrained bitterness, usually fairly well attenuated, often with an adjunct quality, a smooth, easily drinkable lager character. So you can see I've got Dos Equis there. Man, I love a Dos Equis. At like every once in a while when like that's what they've got on tap, I'm down for a Dos Equis Amber. Again, mid ABV, really fairly low to moderately low bitterness, and it's going to be amber in color. So it's going to be about 7 to 14. With the International Amber Lager, this is where we're going to start to see a little bit more malt character. So it's going to be very low to moderate caramel sweet to toasty malty aroma. And this is one thing that I really love about just about every style of amber colored beer or amber beer. So American Amber Ale is the same way. That again, it's kind of like that American wheat beer, but even more so, where you're going to get a very wide range of interpretations of what an international amber lager is. So it can be a very, very low, almost flavor neutral profile to having more of a caramel sweet profile, all the way to having a more of a toasty, malty aroma. And the same is going to be that way for your flavor as well. And then we're going to have a mildly spicy or floral character, if you can perceive that at all. If you can, it's going to be very low. We've got that clean lager profile. It's going to be golden amber to reddish copper, bright clarity, and your head may not be long lasting, and you're going to have white to off-white is going to be your head color. With the flavor, again, there's that big range of interpretation in there. It can vary from being dry to being very sweet. And know that anywhere in between those two, kind of, like the two brackets, anywhere in between that beer is still going to be to style. And you can also get, again, like it can be caramel sweet, it can be toasty bready, it can be very caramel, it can be very toasty, it can be a combination of the two. There's so much room for interpretation with an amber beer. With our hops, low to moderate bitterness, low to moderate herbal, floral, or spicy character. And again, that clean fermentation profile, because we're talking about a lager. The balance can be fairly malty to nearly even, but the bitterness can be noticeable, but not objectionable. So generally when I see descriptions like that, or I see a low level of DMS or a low level of diacetyl, if you're tasting the beer and you're getting a lot of bitterness in your international amber lager and you think, I know the bitterness can be noticeable, but not objectionable, it's probably too much. And it's the same way if it says, a light DMS note is acceptable or a light diacetyl note is acceptable, and you're thinking, is this too much DMS or is this too much diacetyl? It is. Like low means low. And then with our finisher and aftertaste, it's going to be moderately dry with a moderately malty aftertaste. Light to medium body, medium to high carbonation. It's going to be very smooth. Some of your examples may be creamy. Okay, international dark lager. This is going to be very similar to, it's actually in its flavor profile, it's more similar to an American pale lager than it is to a darker version of an international amber lager. And I think I just said American pale lager. I meant international pale lager. So I will just try it again. An international dark lager is going to be more similar to an international pale lager than it is to an international amber lager. And I think that's something that is important to remember. I know it's tripped me up before, is that this is really a dark version of an international pale, not a slightly darker version of an international amber. I hope that distinction makes sense. The low bitterness leaves the malt as your primary flavor element, and the low hop levels provide very little in the way of balance. So this is going to be very similar to in the ABV, IBU, and SRM, or not SRM, but ABV and IBU of international pale and international amber lager. They're all going to be a mid-range ABV. And then this is going to be a dark amber all the way to a brown. So even when we're saying dark, an international dark lager, we're not talking about something like a Schwarzbier or a stout that's going to be black in color. This is going to be more brown in color. So for the commercial examples we have here, we have Baltica number 4, St. Pauli Girl Dark, San Miguel Dark, and Shiner Bock. This is another example of, when we're talking about guidelines, just because it has Bock in its name, it's actually an international dark lager. So, Shiner makes Shiner Bock, and the beer police don't show up to arrest them or fine them for calling it a Bock when really it's an international dark lager. When we're talking about the International Dark Lager, I think this makes it more clear how it is a dark version of an International Pale Lager, because you're really not going to get a lot of malt aroma. You may get some roast and caramel malt aroma, but you may not. You could have none. You're not going to have a lot of hop character. If you do, it's going to again be those more German Czech style hops that are going to be spicy and floral. Clean fermentation profile, and again, a light amount of DMS or corn aroma is not a fault. This is going to be deep amber to dark brown with ruby highlights. And what I like also about this description in particular is one thing I do a lot when I'm filling out a score sheet and I get to the aroma is that, something like this, I would probably say like this is gold in color, actually maybe like a dark straw, which is probably still just gold. But with an International Dark Lager, with other, especially darker beers, you'll get those really pretty, like bright highlights within the beer. So I love that when, the people writing BJCP were writing the descriptions, they put in there those ruby highlights, because it really, for me, it's a good reminder to stop and look and really admire the beer and see if those ruby highlights are there. Your clarity is going to be bright. Your head may not be long lasting, and it's going to be beige to light tan in color. So I have a second poll for you all about the appearance of International Dark Lager. And we talked about this briefly last week as well. So tell me, what ingredient causes the foam of an International Dark Lager to be beige to light tan in color? All right, well, you all are working on that. I'm going to pop over here and go a little bit forward. And I'll give it, let's give it like 7 more seconds. Let's see how long 5 seconds feels in silence. All right, so it looks like most of you, most people have said the caramel and or roasted malt. You are correct. Those are when you're using something like a caramel malt, roasted malt, you'll be using those for flavor. You'll also be using those for color. So when you have a beer like an International Dark Lager, when it says that I went too far, your head can be beige to light tan in color, when you're evaluating a beer, this is particularly helpful if you're evaluating a beer completely blind. When you're evaluating a beer and that head is like beige to light tan in color, that's going to tell you that there's probably, there's going to be roasted malt or caramel malt in it. Typically, I believe is going to be more roasted malt will really cause that head to change color. It's the same thing if you have a beer that has fruit added in it. So if you have a beer that has raspberries in it, it's going to have a pinkish head. So I just asked that question in there to kind of reiterate that your head color is going to give you an indication about what kind of ingredients are in that beer. And I will share these results really quickly, and then I'm going to stop sharing them. Okay. So when we're talking about the flavor, low to medium malty sweetness, no to medium low caramel and or roast malt flavor. So it's important also to pay attention to those and or, because again, it can have none to medium low caramel malt flavors. It can have low to medium or no to medium low roast malt flavors, or it can have a combination of the two. So you've got, again, that really big window where there's tons of room for interpretation. Low to moderate levels of caramel and toasty bready notes can be evident. Low to medium low corny sweetness is optional, but it's not a fault. If you have burnt or strongly roasted malt flavors, those are a defect. Hops, low to medium, again, with something like an International Dark Lager, the malt is really going to be the star of the show. Typically floral, spicy, or herbal if you can detect it. It may have a very light fruitiness. The balance is typically going to be somewhat malty, but it's still going to have that moderately crisp finish. Light to medium light body, medium to high carbonation, and smooth with a light creaminess to it. So next, we're going to move on to Czech Pale Lager. And Czech Pale Lager is one of these styles that people have been judging BJCP for a while, who maybe started using the previous version of the guidelines, really love to like about Czech Pale Lager, because we're going to talk about Czech Pale Lager and then we're going to talk about Czech Premium Pale Lager, and they're really pretty much this was the hairs were split very finely between making these two distinct styles. So with our Czech Pale Lager, this is going to be a lighter bodied, rich, refreshing, hoppy, bitter pale Czech lager, having the familiar flavors of the stronger Czech Premium Pale Lager, but in a lower alcohol, lighter bodied, and slightly less intense format. So the lower alcohol is going to be low in alcohol, is starting to get up a little bit close to being mid-range in alcohol. We have our commercial examples: Notch Session Pills, shout out to Brienne at Notch, Godspeed Brewery, Pivo 10, Pivovar Kut na Smave Kutska 10. And so when we're looking at that degree there, that is degrees Plato. And I believe it is. And then I actually have this book right here that tells me how to pronounce the Czech beers. So this is the Beer Bible by Jeff Allworth. This is actually one of the only beer books I have that I haven't read through cover to cover. But one of the things he has in there is this really nice thing of how to pronounce Czech beer names. So let me see if I can quickly find this. Otherwise, I won't make you guys hang out while I try to read it. Okay, I cannot. I will look it up. But I've already sort of butchered the Czech language, so I'm not going to do that again. When we're talking about the Czech Pale Lager score sheet, this is where, as we're moving into Czech Pale Lagers, next week I believe we'll be talking about German Pilsners. These are going to be all malt beers, so there's not going to be a proportion of corn and rice. The corn and rice is very much an American and also an English beer convention. That doesn't mean that German beers can't or haven't ever had corn or rice, and it doesn't mean, particularly with Belgian styles, some styles may have some corn, not typically rice, but when we're talking about Czech beers, we're talking about 100% malt beers. So that being said, we're going to have more malt character. Your malt is going to be little to moderate, bready, rich. You may have a bit of caramel that's acceptable. Your hops are going to be light to moderate, spicy, or herbal. Fermentation, light but never intrusive diacetyl. Light, fruity, hop-derived esters are acceptable but do not need to be present, and you should not have any kind of sulfur. So sulfur, specifically H2S, is a hallmark in a lot of beers and in a lot of lager beers of a fresh beer or a young beer. With something like a Czech Pale Lager, if you get a whiff of sulfur, that's going to be a fault, like full stop. That's not a low level of sulfur allowable. That's not an indication of a green or a young lager. That's a fault for a Czech Pale Lager. Your color is going to be light gold to deep gold. Clarity, brilliant to very clear. Long-lasting head with a nice, long-lasting creamy white head. Your flavor, you're going to have medium low to medium bready rich flavors. So with a lot, or for the Czech styles we'll be talking about tonight, the malt really is they're all balanced between malt and hops, but something like Czech lagers do a really fantastic job of showcasing things like the barley, the Moravian barley that grows really well in the Czech Republic. And it also does a really good job of highlighting those Saaz noble hops. So the Saaz is kind of the classic Czech hop. And the Czech Pale Lagers just do such a fantastic job of highlighting how, a very simple beer can taste very complex. So with our bitterness, we would expect it to be prominent but never harsh, low to medium high spicy or herbal flavors. Diacetyl or fruit esters are acceptable at low levels, but do not need to be present and should never be overbearing. So there's that note again. If you're tasting a Czech Pale Lager and you are picking up diacetyl and asking yourself, is this too much diacetyl? It is too much diacetyl. And that is, typically when I get a beer like that maybe I don't want to really knock somebody because I think there's too much diacetyl. I will probably leave a note that says something like, this seems slightly high for the style. And then within the feedback, provide some ways that maybe they can decrease that diacetyl back into the acceptable range. Our balance should be flavorful and refreshing. The aftertaste is rounded and hoppy, and mouthfeel, medium light to medium. Carbonation is moderate. So Czech Premium Pale Lager. This is, you may also see, most people I think are more familiar with the phrase Bohemian Pilsner. This is Czech Premium Pale Lager is Bohemian Pilsner. Rich, characterful, pale Czech lager with considerate malt and hop character and a long, rounded finish. Complex, yet well balanced. And the important thing about that rounded finish, that's going to come from the fact that the water around Pilsen, which is the city in the Czech Republic where a lot of our styles, such as Pilsner or Kel, and the Czech Premium Pale Lager styles developed, the water there is very, very soft. And when I say soft, I mean that there's not a lot of minerality to it. So that softness in the water is really what leads to that rounded finish that you'll see in a lot of the Czech lager descriptions. And I'm located in Atlanta and in Georgia, and we have water that is very similar to what you would find in the Czech Republic. Actually, very almost identical to what's in Pilsen. It's the same way in Charlotte, in Virginia Beach, kind of around that, east of the Appalachian Mountains. The water tends to be very soft. So all of that to say, the rounded finish, a lot of times the soft language you see when you're talking about a Czech lager is going to be because that water is very soft. So mid-range ABV, we're starting to get in more bitter territory with a Czech Premium Pale Lager, and your SRM is going to be slightly darker. So the interesting thing about these examples here, Gambrinus, Pilsner Kel, and Prematura Premium are all actually brewed by the exact same brewery, which I did not know until I had a friend who had attended the Siebel School of Brewing tell me that those were all made by the company that has Pilsner Kel. So when we're talking about the aroma, again, we're starting to get a little more flavor kind of as we're moving up in terms of, our ABV and our recipe. So we're going to have medium to medium high bready rich malt. Our hops are going to be, I think this is such a weird descriptor to say it can be medium low to medium high, because I feel like you could just say medium. And I guess that's not quite as precise, but medium high to medium low just seems like a very strange bracket to put around hop flavor, but nobody asked me. So that's going to be spicy, floral, or herbal hops. Fermentation, light but never intrusive diacetyl. So one of the hallmarks of Czech Premium Pale Lager is going to be that a low level of diacetyl is possible. And so I'm going to ask you all my last polling question today. Why are low levels of diacetyl acceptable in Czech lagers? Is it because diacetyl is a hallmark of all lagers, or is it because Pilsner or Kel yeast is bad at cleaning up diacetyl? And I will let you all answer that. When we're talking about the appearance, that's going to be gold to deep gold. Our clarity is going to be brilliant to very clear. Our head retention, one thing about a Czech Premium Pale Lager is that it's got a beautiful, dense, long-lasting, creamy white head. And it looks like we are in a dead heat with this question. And this is a little bit of kind of a jerk question, because this is, I feel like if I know a couple of people in the audience who are going to know the answer to this right away. It's a little bit of an esoteric question. So I will tell all of you all, low levels of diacetyl are acceptable in Czech lagers because Pilsner or Kel is the original Czech Premium Pale Lager. There's a very fun story behind Pilsner or Kel and the city of Pilsen, but the Pilsner or Kel yeast, so Pilsner or Kel is very much like the Budweiser or the Guinness Draft. It is the definition of the style. So what have I been saying? If you make the rules, you get to break the rules. Pilsner or Kel yeast is not very good at cleaning up diacetyl, which is why when we're talking about Czech lagers, you'll see that a low level of diacetyl is acceptable. So again, that's just a fun I guess if you're dazzling people with your super nerdy beer knowledge, that's one of those things you can tell them. So that's the end of my questions for you all for tonight. And then when we are talking about the flavor, again, we're going to have a very rich, complex, bready malt with a little bit of caramel impression. Your bitterness is going to be prominent, but never harsh. Low to medium high, spicy or floral hops. Again, diacetyl, fruity levels are acceptable at low levels, but don't need to be present. Your beer can be balanced for the hops or the malt, but it's never aggressively tilted either way. So it's like we were saying earlier, here's your balance. It can be here or it can be here, but it's never going to be here and it's never going to be there. So if you have a beer that you're wondering, like, is this too, hop forward in the finish? It probably is. Mouthfeel, or I'm sorry, body is going to be medium. Your carbonation is going to be medium to low. Then the last two we'll wrap up with are the Czech Amber Lager and the Czech Dark Lager. The Czech Amber Lager, again, is going to be a lot like that International Amber Lager where there's room for a lot of interpretation in there. So that is a malt-driven amber Czech lager with hop character that can vary from low to quite significant. The malt flavor can vary quite a bit, leading to different interpretations, leading from drier, bready, and slightly biscuity to sweeter and somewhat caramelly. So all of our Czech, with the exception of the Czech Pale Lager, our Czech Premium Pale, Czech Amber, Czech Dark, those are all going to be almost exactly the same in terms of your ABV range. Your IBUs, again, are going to start to push into more of a slightly bitter, or they can into more of a bitter perception. And then our commercial examples, I'm not even going to try to butcher those anymore, but just know that I will give you all this reference on how to pronounce Czech names. And I will strive to do better the next time I have this presentation to say it just all smooth and confident so everybody thinks I'm super good at pronouncing Czech. So aroma is going to be moderate intensity. This is going to be either bready and Maillard product-like or slightly caramel and candy-like. So again, it can be on kind of that sweet side, or it can be more on that kind of toasty, drier side. Our hops will be moderate to none, spicy, floral, or herbal. Clean lager character, low stone fruit or berry esters may be present. Diacetyl is optional and can range from low to none. So that, again, that's an important thing to note, is just because it says a low level of diacetyl may be present doesn't mean as you're judging a beer that you should fault it if you don't get diacetyl in it. Appearance is going to be deep amber to copper, clear to bright clarity, large and persistent off-white head. Flavor, medium to medium high complex malt flavor is dominant. Again, it's going to vary from dry and Maillard-like. So when we're talking about Maillard, we're talking about, sometimes you may also see it as something like browning. So if you're thinking about roasting vegetables, right, you're going from maybe a very light toast or bread crust to more of a biscuit, all the way, starting to get more nutty and more toasty, but not roasty. And then on the other end, you can have more of that caramelly sweet flavor. So there's a lot of room in between for tons of different kinds of interpretations. Some examples have candy-like to graham cracker malt character, but again, you should never have any roasted malt. So a roasted malt flavor will be inappropriate in a Czech Amber Lager. Prominent but clean bitterness, low to moderate spicy hop flavors, subtle plum or berry esters are optional. And again, that low diacetyl is also optional. Your aftertaste can vary from dry and hoppy to relatively sweet. Your mouthfeel will be medium to medium full, carbonation moderate to low. Other palate sensations, soft and round, often with a gentle creaminess. And then our last style we're going to talk about tonight is Czech Dark Lager. This is a rich, dark, malty Czech lager with a roast character that can vary from almost absent to quite prominent. Malty with an interesting and complex flavor profile with variable levels of hopping, providing a range of possible interpretations. Again, a Czech Dark Lager. This is one of my favorite styles. I was at a Czech beer garden over the weekend and was just knocking back half liters of Czech Dark Lager because I enjoy it so much. So again, mid-range ABV and fairly mid-range IBU is going to be a little bit darker. So again, though, when we're talking about dark lager, a Czech dark lager can go all the way to a 35 SRM, which is going to be a very dark brown, but it can also be as light as a 14. And so just for reference, something like an American IPA can be as dark as a 14. So that's going to be kind of that amber color. So your Czech dark lager can still be kind of amber in color. And then we have our other Bohemian Brewery Chernybach, the Notch Cerne Pivo, and the Ufleko, Flakowski, Tmave, Lejszak. Ufleko is an iconic, it is the Czech dark lager producer, and it is they only produce it on site. So you can't buy the Ufleku anywhere except in the Czech Republic at that brewery. That is a goal of mine. So when we're talking about the aroma, it's going to be medium to medium high, rich, deep, sometimes sweet maltiness. You can have, again, optional. So it can have any of these, it can have none of these, it can have any combination of these. Bread crust, toast, nuts, cola fruit, dark fruit, caramel. Roasted malt characters such as chocolate or sweetened coffee. Again, that's going to vary from moderate to none, but it shouldn't overwhelm the base malt character. So it can be roasty. You can have those chocolate flavors. You can have those coffee flavors, but it shouldn't be overwhelming what your base malt flavors are going to be, which is going to be more of that bread crust, toast, nuts, cola, dark fruit, probably not dark fruit and caramel. Those are going to be more of your caramel malt flavors. Hops are going to be low and spicy. Fermentation, low stone fruit or berry esters may be present. Diacetyl is optional and can range from low to none. Your appearance, dark copper to almost black, often with a red or garnet tint. Clear to bright clarity, consistent head retention is going to be off-white to tan, again, because it's likely going to have some of those roasted and caramel malts in there that are going to tint the color of that head. Your malt flavor is going to be medium to medium high. It's going to be a deep malt complexity. You're going to have all of those different ranges of malt flavors along with a very low to moderate roast character. Your hop flavor is going to be none to moderately low. If it's there, it's going to be spicy. And your bitterness is going to be medium low to moderate. And we see that diacetyl and light plum and berry esters may be present. And the balance is going to vary from malty to relatively well balanced to gently hop forward. So again, we're kind of, here's well balanced. It can be like malty or it can be gently hop forward. So it's going to be somewhere in there. Your mouthfeel will be medium to medium full, medium to low carbonation. Your alcohol can have a slight warmth in stronger versions. And your other palate sensations, it can be moderately creamy in texture. It can also be described as smooth. So that is the end of the slides. And this time I actually finished like kind of a little bit early. So let me stop sharing my screen. A couple of things before I forget, and I will, since I have some work to do on these slides, I will add an additional resources slide again. So as a reminder, when I'm talking about additional resources, these are not resources that you have to go out and buy. This is if you're reading about lagers, if you see something that really sparks your interest and you're wanting to learn more about a particular style outside of studying for an exam, I've got some books to recommend for you. And I will give, I won't do a poll for this, but let me pull up the chat just so I can see. If anybody, like in the next few seconds, so I'm about to recommend some of my favorite books about the beers that we talked tonight. I know I've got some people out there who listen to the podcast and who've been around me for like 5 minutes, more than 5 minutes. I want you, if you know one of the books I'm going to suggest, I want you to put it in the chat. Because once you see it, you're going to be like, yeah, of course, she suggested that one. So books that I would recommend. Ambitious Brew. This is a fantastic book. I'm actually only about halfway through it. It's pretty good so far. This is all about the growth of beer in the United States. So this is it's a very interesting book. Another one, Dark Lagers. This is by Thomas Weyermann of Weyermann Yeast and Horst Dornbusch. This again, this book is great to learn the history of dark lagers, learn how to brew them, and also how to and it also contains recipes. This is just a cool book. So if you're interested in especially something like a Czech dark lager, I've brewed a Czech dark lager from this book that turned out really well. And I see, yes, Angelica, you got it. The lager book. All I do is talk about this lager book. This book is so, so good. If you buy one book the entire time that you're doing this judging, make it the lager book. It's just so good. It's written very well. It's written by Mark Dredge. He actually won an award with the North American Guild of Beer Writers this year for best book. It's just really good. I talk about it all the time. It's also available as an audiobook if if listening to an audiobook is easier for you than reading. I have not listened to the audiobook version of it, but I am told that it's very good. So those are just some quick books if you're looking to learn more about lagers that are more less technical and just more fun reads and teaches you about the history and everything surrounding lagers. So I've got 2 minutes. I'm going to try very hard to get through all these questions on time. Okay, let's see. So for international dark lagers, any idea of what percent of the grain bill is caramel or roasted malt? Off the top of my head, I don't. I do have my handy guidelines right here that I will look. I'm going to say that it varies, but let's look at the characteristic ingredients. It does not say. So it gives me 2-hour, 6-row barley, corn, rice, or sugars as adjuncts, light use of caramel and darker malts. So when I hear light use, if I'm building a recipe, then I'm probably going to start around maybe 10%. I definitely wouldn't go up more than 15%. But Sandra, let me look and see if I can't find some better information for you on that. I will say a really great resource if you're a member of the American Homebrewers Association. One of for me, the things I love the most about being a member of the AHA is the recipes. And one thing that they started doing in the members area of the recipes is they've actually started aggregating them. So you can go and find, like 10 Kolsch recipes for after you mow the lawn or something. And it gives you, again, that range of recipes. So I would encourage you also to maybe, if you're a member of the AHA, go check out those recipes of the website and see if you can get a better idea of what proportion. Again, when I see something like light use, that I'm thinking is probably like 10 to 15%. With something like a roasted malt, especially, you really only need a very small amount. If any of you have ever tasted roasted malt straight, you need to have a glass of water handy because it immediately dries out your mouth. It's also very, very mealy and kind of hard to chew, but you will also learn that you only need 1 or 2 kernels to totally get the idea behind roasted malt. So all of that to say, if you're building a recipe, anything that's going to have roasted malt, you really need, really like maybe 2 to 5% roasted malt, and that's going to give you the roasted flavors and the color that you need. So with that, we are right at 8:30. Thank you everyone for joining me today. This has been, again, really kind of tough few days. And I have so looked forward to being able to come here tonight and talk with you all about beer styles. So I will get my slides corrected, and going forward, we'll do a little bit better of a job making sure that those are all correct before we start for the week. I've got some time on my hands now, so I will definitely be able to do that and get them uploaded. And I will also aim starting next week to have the notes version of all of the slides for you ahead of time. So please, as always, reach out when you have any questions. Let me know how I can help. Again, if you would like to use the Zoom space for any kind of a discussion or safe space or meeting or anything, please just let me know. And I'm happy to work with you to get that scheduled. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next week. Bye.